We love stories of courage, but only the kind that comes with witnesses, the kind that ends with medals, standing ovations and nods of approval. We imagine bravery with backup, resistance with applause, faith that speaks and gets retweeted. But what happens when courage means silence? When truth means exile? When obedience leads you not into history, but into the dark? This was Bonhoeffer's path, not surrounded, not applauded, alone, and faithful anyway. He didn't become a symbol by trying to be one. He became a threat because he obeyed without permission, because he spoke when no one wanted to hear, because he refused to wait for support. In a time when the church bowed, when the theologians adjusted, when friends hesitated, Bonhoeffer kept walking. Not because he was louder, but because he was anchored. Obedience wasn't a strategy, it was a surrender. And that's the heart of this story. Not that he died for Christ, but that he lived faithfully when it cost him everything, and no one followed. So let's go back. Not to the gallows, but to the decision before it. The moment when Bonhoeffer realized, if I obey, I may have to walk this road alone. And still, he obeyed. Adolf Hitler rises to power. The swastika unfurls across cathedrals. Bishops hold up Bibles in one hand and give the Nazi salute with the other. Pastors declare the Führer as a gift from God. The German church, meant to proclaim Christ alone, begins to merge theology with nationalism. Bonhoeffer watches, horrified. He's only 27, but already he sees what others pretend not to. Where Christ is not Lord alone, someone else always will be. While others speak of peace, he speaks of truth. While others seek harmony, he seeks the cross. He warns that the church cannot serve two masters, Christ and the Reich. That neutrality is already betrayal. That silence, in a moment like this, is the first sermon of cowardice. He preaches it. He writes it. He says it to his friends, his colleagues, his students, and most of them look away. They nod politely. They murmur agreement. But when it comes to standing with him, they vanish. The church didn't fall all at once. It didn't wake up and declare itself loyal to evil. It bowed slowly, softly, one silent sermon at a time. And Bonhoeffer? He couldn't be quiet. He wouldn't make peace with a gospel that served comfort, because he knew that when the church goes quiet, Christ is no longer being preached. And that's when it began. The long, slow exile of obedience, not forced, not dramatic, just one man refusing to lower his voice, while everyone else turned down the volume. It was April 1st, 1933. Bonhoeffer stepped into a Berlin radio station with a manuscript in hand. He wasn't there to preach rebellion. He was there to speak about leadership, about the moral responsibility of those in power. He started carefully, calm, composed, thoughtful. A leader must submit to higher authority, or he becomes a misleader. He was building towards something sharp, something sacred. He was about to name the danger that Germany refused to see. That charisma without character leads to catastrophe. That any leader not bowed before God is already bowed before something darker. And then silence, mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-truth. They cut the transmission. The broadcast went dead, not due to technical error, but by deliberate censorship. Bonhoeffer's voice vanished from the airwaves, and what followed? Nothing, no outcry, no letters, no protest from his colleagues, just silence. The very thing he had warned about happened to him, in real time, in front of a nation. It was the first time Bonhoeffer was silenced, and the first time he realized what his obedience would cost, even his voice. He wasn't thrown in prison, he wasn't exiled, but something far lonelier happened. Everyone stayed quiet. And that, in many ways, was worse. Because when evil begins to rise, it's not the enemies that silence you first. It's your own side saying, Now is not the time. But Bonhoeffer knew if you wait for the right time to speak truth, you're already too late. And he never stopped speaking, even when the microphone was turned off. The German church has bowed. The Reich controls the pulpits. Baptisms are recorded in Nazi registries, and Jesus is slowly being replaced with blood and soil, but not everyone bends. A new movement emerges, a breakaway group of pastors, theologians, and believers. They call themselves the Confessing Church. They write the Barmen Declaration, a bold line in the sand. Jesus Christ is the one word of God whom we must hear and whom we must trust and obey. It was defiant, it was biblical, it was courageous, and it still wasn't enough, because Bonhoeffer could see what others ignored, that many who signed the declaration still feared the consequences of obedience. They would affirm truth on paper, but whisper it in public. They believed, but they wouldn't follow. They agreed, but they wouldn't stand. Bonhoeffer wasn't just fighting state power. He was fighting the half measures of those around him, people who wanted to resist, but didn't want to lose their titles, didn't want to lose their pensions, didn't want to lose their place. And in that moment, he saw something terrifying. Even among the brave few were willing to walk the road of obedience to the end. He was in the meetings, in the rooms, among friends, and yet already alone. Because courage is not signing a statement, it's living the statement when it costs you everything. And most weren't ready for that. But Bonhoeffer was, and he didn't stop walking. Bonhoeffer disappears from public view. No headlines, no sermons in Berlin, no grand protests. He retreats to a quiet place called Finkenwalde, a remote village, a rented house, a gathering of young men, not for safety, but for sanctification. Because while the church bowed, Bonhoeffer believed the only true resistance left was to train men who would die faithful rather than live compromised. There were no degrees awarded, no ordinations announced, just a rhythm of prayer, fasting, scripture, confession, silence, a brotherhood forged not by ambition, but by surrender. He taught them that theology wasn't information, it was formation. It wasn't about what you knew. It was about who you'd remain loyal to when the fire came. Who is Jesus Christ for us today? He asked it daily. Not as a question for theory, but a question that demanded a life. Every day in Finkenwalde was defiance. Every psalm sung in whispered harmony was a sermon that couldn't be censored. Every discipline was a preparation for martyrdom, because Bonhoeffer knew the church would not be rescued, it would be tested, and only those trained in obedience could carry it through collapse. He didn't give them hope, he gave them truth. And that's what made Finkenwalde dangerous. It was a seminary without walls, a resistance movement built on silence, surrender, and sacred fire. And that fire was about to be tested. War is coming. Bonhoeffer boards a ship to New York, invited by theologians, colleagues, even friends, who beg him to stay. He arrives at Union Seminary, the lectures awaiting, the letters of recommendation ready. A life of teaching, safety, and quiet scholarship lies ahead. For the first time in years, he can breathe, he can live without fear, he can write without surveillance, he can rest. But something in him won't rest. He walks the streets of Manhattan, he writes in his journals, and a storm brews not outside but within. I have made a mistake, he writes. I must live through this difficult time with the Christian people of Germany. I have no right to participate in the rebuilding of Christian life after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. In a single decision, he leaves safety behind. No applause, no announcement. Just a silent boarding pass and a one-way return to a country he knows is ready to arrest him. This wasn't recklessness, this was discipleship, because Bonhoeffer believed you cannot call people to carry a cross you are not willing to carry yourself. Not to act is to act, he had once said. Now it was time to live it. And so he returns. To danger, to exile, to betrayal. This was the moment not of his death, but of his radical obedience, the moment he chose the fire, because standing alone with Christ was worth more than surviving without him. He returns. No welcome, no parade, no pulpit waiting, just suspicion and distance. The Nazis are watching. His mail is censored. His lectures are banned. His movements monitored. But even more devastating, his friends begin to disappear. Quietly, softly, not in betrayal, but in retreat. Those who once praised him now say nothing. Those who studied under him avoid his name. Even leaders in the confessing church start stepping back. They admired his courage from afar. But few were willing to walk beside it, because Bonhoeffer's very presence was dangerous. To know him was to risk interrogation. To quote him was to risk surveillance. To stand with him was to risk everything. And so they didn't. He wasn't excommunicated. He was exiled by silence. Not by the state, but by the people he once called brothers. Still, he didn't curse them, didn't shame them, didn't demand loyalty, because Bonhoeffer's obedience was not dependent on fellowship. He had already given his yes to Christ, and if that meant walking into total isolation, so be it. Being a Christian is less about cautiously avoiding sin than about courageously and actively doing God's will. And God's will had led him here, not into crowds, but into quiet. And he kept walking. There were no crowds left, no headlines, no microphones, no safety. But Bonhoeffer didn't stop. Why? Because for him, obedience was never about the outcome, never about admiration, never about recognition. It was about truth, lived, followed, obeyed, even when unseen. In Finkenwalde he had taught this. In Berlin he had preached this. Now in the growing silence he was proving it. Only he who believes is obedient. Only he who is obedient believes. This wasn't theory. This was his blood, his breath, his daily rhythm. Even as the walls closed in, even as the church forgot him, even as the resistance distanced themselves, Bonhoeffer walked forward without needing to be understood, because he believed obedience is not reactive, it's responsive. It answers to one voice and walks even if no one follows. He didn't need confirmation, he didn't wait for results, he didn't demand clarity, because true obedience doesn't demand explanations. It moves when God speaks, not when the world agrees. And this is where most fall away. They ask, will this work? Bonhoeffer asked, is this right? And that was enough. In a world that trades truth for trends, Bonhoeffer followed conviction without applause. And that is the obedience that shakes kingdoms. By 1941, even the confessing church had grown tired of fighting, tired of hiding, tired of standing. They had signed declarations, whispered sermons, defied in word, if not always in action. But now the fear was louder than their faith. The Gestapo had begun arresting pastors, churches were closed, homes raided, and even among the confessors, compromise crept in. Some rewrote their sermons, some softened their stances, some simply stopped speaking altogether. And Bonhoeffer? He watched them go quiet, not with anger, but with sorrow. These were not traitors, these were friends. Men who had once wept with him, prayed with him, walked with him. But now they whispered from a distance, or not at all. We're still with you, Dietrich, they would say, but not in public, not in writing, not when it cost them anything. And so the circle grew smaller, the support thinner, the silence heavier, because even among the remnant, obedience has a limit. And Bonhoeffer had passed it. He wasn't trying to outdo them, he wasn't judging them. but he had already surrendered everything. And that meant walking further than most were willing to go, even if it meant walking alone, because the call of Christ had no crowd attached, no committee, no consensus, just a voice and a narrow road. And Bonhoeffer stayed on it, even when no one else would. By now, Bonhoeffer wasn't just isolated, he was alone, not because he wanted to be, but because no one else was willing to go where obedience led. His family worried for him, his colleagues stopped writing, the church no longer quoted him, and the state, it watched closely. He had become untouchable, not because he was dangerous, but because his faith had gone too far to explain, too far to soften, too far to be tolerated, even by the faithful. He wasn't walking ahead of others, he was walking without them. This wasn't rebellion, it wasn't spectacle, it was the quiet resolve of a man who knew who he served. And when you reach that point, there are no maps, no mentors, no likes, only the road, and the one who called you to walk it. Bonhoeffer never called himself a prophet. He never claimed sainthood. He didn't demand loyalty. He just kept going, day by day, prayer by prayer, step by obedient step, because he knew it's better to walk with God in the dark than walk with the world in the light. He wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying to be faithful. And sometimes that means standing so alone. You forget what a crowd even sounds like. But Bonhoeffer never forgot the voice that started it all. So he walked, alone, and yet never forsaken. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't come from uncertainty, but from clarity. Bonhoeffer didn't waver. He wasn't confused. He wasn't bitter. He saw what was happening with precision, with scripture in one hand and conscience in the other. We are not simply to bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. He knew the church had failed. He knew the state had become a god. He knew silence was no longer neutral. It was complicity. But the deeper that clarity became, the fewer people could bear to hear it. Friends told him he was being too intense. Colleagues called him unrealistic. Even allies begged him to be more careful. But what do you do when the truth inside you burns louder than the excuses around you? You carry it, quietly, with sorrow, not superiority, with trembling, not triumph, because being right doesn't make you immune to heartbreak. It just gives you a cross to carry it with no one to help lift it. Bonhoeffer didn't write manifestos, he wrote letters. He didn't shout, he prayed. And in that stillness, he held the unbearable weight. That sometimes, when no one else can see what you see, you carry the truth alone like a fire in your chest. And you keep walking, even when it hurts, even when it isolates, even when the path goes straight to the gallows, because you weren't obeying for agreement, you were obeying for God. At first the letters came, encouragement, prayers, quiet admiration from a distance. But then they came less, and then not at all. Not because they stopped caring, but because they were afraid. To write Bonhoeffer meant being watched. To visit him meant being marked. To speak his name meant being remembered by the wrong people. And so they didn't. His mailbox grew silent. The echo of fellowship faded. Even the boldest friends went still. But Bonhoeffer didn't curse them, didn't resent them, didn't shame them. He prayed for them. He still wrote letters full of grace, lines full of quiet hope. I am so thankful that I have been allowed this time of quiet. It's not the darkness of the cell that troubles me, but the inner light I must protect. Even in chains, he offered peace. Because Bonhoeffer's obedience was never about whether others approved. It was about being faithful when no one else could afford to be. The silence around him didn't change the fire within him. The absence of friends didn't extinguish the presence of God. He obeyed anyway. He wrote anyway. He forgave anyway, because obedience that needs fellowship isn't obedience, it's momentum. And Bonhoeffer wasn't moving with the crowd. He was walking with Christ, even in abandonment, even in prison, even in the slow fade of every human connection. He kept saying yes, and that kind of faith doesn't need a reply. April 5th, 1943. He is arrested. No struggle, no outburst. Just a quiet departure from house to cell. Tegel prison, then Buchenwald. Eventually, Flossenburg. Each move deeper, each room smaller, each guard more suspicious. But Bonhoeffer, still writing, still praying, still mentoring even the guards who chained him. He wasn't clinging to freedom. He had already surrendered it years ago in a moment of decision. This wasn't resignation, it wasn't defeat, it was peace in obedience. Who stands fast? He had once asked. Only the one whose final standard is not reason, not conscience, not freedom, but readiness to sacrifice all for obedience to God. And now he was living that line. He didn't protest his innocence. He didn't demand an audience. He didn't even ask to be remembered, because he believed that faith is most pure when no one is watching. Even as the rope was prepared, even as the guards whispered about his fate, Bonhoeffer remained calm, not out of strength, but out of surrender. He had stopped asking for outcomes. He was living in the answer, and the answer was, "Yes, Lord." Obedience had taken him from pulpit to prison, from fellowship to solitude, from sermons to silence. But he never changed direction, because he was never following a cause. He was following Christ, and that meant this path, though narrow, though dark, was still holy. April 9th, 1945. Flossenburg concentration camp. The war is almost over. The Allies are weeks away, but Bonhoeffer's name is on a list signed by men who fear his faith more than his voice. He's led to a small room, asked to undress, then to wait. He kneels to pray. No cries, no pleading, just submission. A witness. A Nazi doctor would later write, "I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer kneeling in prayer, brave and composed. I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." And he wasn't dying as a rebel. He wasn't dying as a hero. He was dying as a disciple. He had walked the long road, lost the crowd, surrendered his comfort, been exiled, forgotten, misunderstood, and still he obeyed. Obedience didn't keep him alive, but it kept him true. There was no sermon, no final defense, just one last breath, and then stillness. And that's what made his death sacred, because Bonhoeffer didn't just die for a belief. He died still walking, even with no one left to walk with him, not for applause, not for legacy, but for the joy of being faithful until the end. And in that quiet moment, he stood more defiantly than any rebel ever could, alone, calm, and in the presence of the one he had obeyed all along. We love Bonhoeffer now. We quote him, we post him, we frame his face next to words about courage and conscience. But what we forget is this: he didn't feel brave. He felt alone. There was no soundtrack, no halo, no crowd cheering as he walked the road. There was just Christ and the call to obey when everyone else was waiting for things to feel safer. So we have to ask, what about us? In an age of algorithms and applause, when faith becomes performance, when silence feels strategic, when conviction is measured by likes, would we obey if no one clapped? Would we stand if no one stood beside us? Bonhoeffer didn't resist to be remembered. He obeyed because truth had already taken hold of him. He didn't count the cost. He carried it. And he didn't let go even when it crushed him, because he knew obedience is not an act of strength. It's an act of surrender. So again, we must ask, what will we do when the church bows to comfort? When friends retreat into silence? When truth costs us everything but promises nothing? Will we wait or will we walk? Because Bonhoeffer didn't stand to make a point. He stood because Christ had already knelt for him. And now the question is not about legacy, it's about loyalty, not about who remembers us, but who we follow. Would you still obey if the only person who knew you did was God? That's the courage Bonhoeffer showed us. And it still speaks. Now it's your turn.